Okay, we're official now. And I'll check the roll before we go, make sure that I got everybody. I tried to check you all in on the way in. So hopefully it all worked out. So good morning. And how are you? I hope things are going well. It's supposed to rain, so hopefully it won't be, taking out our internet this morning. I'm sure it won't. How could that possibly happen? Would never happen, would it? All right, let me see if I successfully opened any of the Eh, yeah, yeah. No, I almost got all the stuff open that I wanted to. Let me try to open one more thing. I don't remember what it is. Unit questions, that's what it is. Oh, all right. Did we talk about John Winthrop? We didn't, did we? So we probably should do that today, shouldn't we? Yeah, of course we should. All right. Okay. Let's start with, okay, I started working on the document analysis sample, and I'll finish that when we're done with class. That'll be the thing that I work on. And then I'll post it before I do other things that distract me. So I thought, well, what document could I use that everybody's kind of familiar with, but I'm probably not going to use, because I was thinking, well, which document am I going to use for Unit 2? And I was thinking Washington's farewell address, or maybe the preamble, preamble to the Constitution. Then I was thinking, everybody knows the preamble to the Constitution. Let's do something a little different. So my sample one is a Declaration of Independence, because I'm not going to use that. Although I could, couldn't I? What in the world? Why is United States not capitalized? All right, so what I'm doing is answering the questions, so you can see kind of a sample of how to go about it. And my sample is going to be just answering directly after the question. Although it made the number blue, I don't know why that happened. And when I finish this today, yeah, I'll do this today. I'll post it, but just a sample so you can see about how much detail I was kind of looking for. I know some of you are going, shouldn't you have done this before? Yes, but I'm doing it now. So if you're working on this already, if you want to hold off turning it in, you can kind of peek at this, but you don't have to either. I realized I didn't give you a sample, the first one. Although, do I have to give you a sample for everything? No, but it is helpful. So yeah, my goal, of course, is to be helpful. So I'll finish this and post this hopefully by noon. Yeah, I'll make it first on my list of stuff to accomplish today, and that'll be good. All right. So, again, the goal on this is to give you an idea of how much detail to put in, probably a little more detail than you would like. But I also don't want you to write 12 pages either. And it is kind of hard to find that sweet spot, because I know you've got 100 things to do. However, I'm really not asking for a ridiculous amount of work. It's not nearly as much as in a long semester, but I know it's condensed and it's hard and you've got a job. I don't know, some kids screaming at you or something. I know. All right. Or one of you has, I don't know, sports practice or something you were telling me about. That was interesting. All right. And in this document analysis, I would fully expect sections 4 and 5 to be the longest ones. And by the time I'm done, that's probably how this will work. And you may or may not, it depends on the document, have quite as much to say about the author of the document. If you read my sample, which I'm sure you will, you're probably just dying. It's like, oh my gosh, I can hardly wait till her sample is done. But what you'll notice is I read about the author at the point at which he has written, or she has written, the document. So, I don't talk about Thomas Jefferson as president or the Louisiana Purchase or anything like that, because, he wrote the Declaration of Independence in 76, and he hadn't done a lot. I mean, he'd done a lot of cool things already, but he hadn't done all the cool things yet. So kind of talking about him as he was at the time the document was written, and when and where the document was written, an intended audience, and I was kind of mid-sentence when I saved this, wasn't I? So I'm sure I'm going to say was additionally the British Parliament, the English people, and the people of the world. Yeah, I don't know if they really intended. No, they knew that it was going to be read really broadly throughout the world because they were in the middle of well, not the middle, the beginning of a revolution. And they'd been fighting for a couple of years, so they knew people were paying attention. So they knew that this was not going to be, like a little note or a private document. So it's part of the reason that they had a committee of 5 people to write it. And they said, let's pick the best guy to write it, the best writer of the group. So they picked Thomas Jefferson, and they discuss it several times. It goes through many drafts, and I'll probably even mention a few things that they take out in the drafts, like, that the initial document said that slavery was evil, which I know you're going like, Thomas Jefferson owned some slaves, but he said slavery was evil. Yeah, Jefferson, very complex person, for sure. All right. So I'll finish that and post that today in the course documents page. Okay. Something to look forward to, isn't it? All right. Let's see what happens next. Yeah, let's look at the questions. Yeah, let's look at the unit questions. All right, so we've already talked about number 1. We'll talk about number 2 for a little while, perhaps. John Winthrop distinguished between natural and moral liberty. What was the difference? How did moral liberty work? How did Puritans define liberty and freedom? Now, unless you noticed probably yesterday when I was talking that I probably like discussions of theology more than the average person. You probably did notice that, didn't you? I know I took a rogue year out of college to go to seminary. I know it was a weird thing to do. Most people my era, probably a little earlier, go backpacking across the United States or hitchhiking or go to Europe, not my socioeconomic class. Yeah, I took a year off and went to seminary. So no, I'm weird. So I had to get at least one question in there that I thought would be interesting. Now, when you're answering questions like this, because like 2 of you will answer this one, but again, I put it in for me. It's one of the joys of getting to teach one of these classes. The textbook, the textbook. Where's the textbook? Yep. Okay. It has these amazing book parts. When I was a little kid, we always talked about book parts. Probably your favorite book part should become the index. So if you go to the index, back of the book, it'll tell you the page number to find John Winthrop. Not that chapter 2 is huge. I know that it's not. And the sections are labeled so nicely that you probably would find it pretty quickly. But if you go to the back, it says that John Winthrop is not in the book. No, it doesn't say that. I can't turn the page. I'm telling you, got all kinds of problems, don't I? So Winthrop, if you're answering this question, Winthrop, where are you? Page 56. Okay, let's see if that's true. Would the book lie to us? Surely not. And at some point I read, what was the book about Winthrop? Oh, Puritan Dilemma. Yeah, that it is not on page 56. That is a lie. I must have read it wrong. Yeah, maybe it is on page 56. All right, but John Winthrop, let's find that's Virginia. Where's Massachusetts? It should be after that. Maryland, Puritanism. Must be 66. I bet I read it wrong. Yeah, yep, 66. Okay, you're chatting. You're going like, sorry, old. It was 66. Yeah. Yes. So the natural liberty is the idea that you're free to do whatever you want. And the moral liberty is you need to be constrained. Can we say constrained? Is that it? But that's what you said. That's what Jonathan said much more clearly than I said, that you got to do the right thing. Now, the tricky thing about deciding what is the right thing is whose standard do you pick? Well, it's really not tricky for John Winthrop because he's a Puritan. So there's really only one standard, and that's the Bible. The Bible. Yeah. So he says that you're only really free if you follow the constraints of the Bible. So whatever the Bible tells you to do, tells you not to do, that sort of thing. So if you start around page 66, it will give you more information about this. And the book it talks about all kinds of people's views of liberty and freedom and that sort of stuff. So you will see that very distinctly in here. And you can bring in examples of, constraining people's liberties, like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, about how maybe their freedom ended up causing people to have, to struggle, to stumble, that sort of thing. And then the document about John Winthrop talking about liberty is on page 77. So for this, I think I would go, I would probably look at, so this is, I just said, didn't I, 77 for that Voices of Freedom thing. And then you could probably start this page 76 in your textbook. Okay. And again, use the textbook to help you with these. I think that's going to work better than looking stuff up online. Do you think Wikipedia has an article about John Winthrop and moral liberty versus natural liberty? Who can say? Who can say? All right. And Winthrop will also point out that if you follow natural liberty, then you're going to harm other people, harm yourself, that sort of thing. And that could lead to, well, he's not, I think that your traditional view, I have no idea what your traditional view of Christianity would be. The thought might be that if you do the wrong thing, you'll go to hell. That probably is that your traditional view of how Christianity views things? And that sort of depends on whose view of Christianity. Now, the Winthrop view of Christianity is going to be, no, your actions are not going to change whether you go to heaven or hell because of predestination. Did we talk about predestination? I think we did. But the idea that God has already predetermined whether you're going to heaven or hell, and that's decided before you're born. I know some of you are going, that's not even fair. Yeah, it's cool if you're a Puritan because, God's picked you. So if God didn't pick you, like, too bad for you. And there's really no way to know if God picked you. So you just kind of have to get feeling whether God picked you or not. So why those guys are so tense and occasionally kill some witches. But natural liberty, if you are prone, in Winthrop's way of thinking about this, if you are prone to doing things that violate the will of God as expressed in the Bible, then you probably are not part of the elect. You're probably not part of the group that God is predestined to go to heaven. And if you do things like that and you don't feel bad and try to reform, because you did notice that Puritans like reform quite a bit, right? They're always trying to change, not necessarily outside folks, but their communities, so that, city on a hill, that sort of thing. They'd be a better example. If you're not concerned about that reform element in your life, then again, you're probably not one of the elect. Yeah. So there you go. All right. So yeah, when you discuss the restrictions of moral liberty, talk about Williams and Anne Hutchinson and look at that speech. Okay. All right. So page 66, page 77, and probably everything there in between will help you with that question. And I know we've already discussed this, but how long should the answer be? Never ask that question, by the way. Let someone else ask it because someone always does. But typically these answers are at least a page long. And remember, you're doing one a week. One, I know you're going like, but I have to do the document thing too. Okay, you're doing 2 things a week, 2 things a week. Yeah. So, you want to get as many points as possible. Now, I'm also not saying, please don't just write stuff to write it on there. Make sure you write stuff that answers the question. So details, specific examples, always, that's what I'm looking for. That'll be a little harder with number 1, a little easier with number 2. And my guess is typically I make everybody answer every question. Yeah, that is true. But in the summer, it's so short. I'm thinking when I had these, I used these questions last semester. The ones people did probably the best on, probably 3 and 4. 3 because it's probably more interesting to the average person and impactful, emotional, that sort of thing. And then 4 because you've got a list of things you can talk about. So, you can talk about taxes, you can talk about taxation without representation, you can talk about, oh gosh, excuse me, the treaty that ends the 7 Years' War, the Treaty of Paris. You can talk about um, the line of settlement. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of specifics. So I think that's a little easier for people. But you should answer the one you like the most. There you go. All right. I don't know. Was that helpful enough on question 2? We could talk more about it if you like. And probably what we'll do, we'll work through chapter 3 today, chapter 4 on Wednesday, tomorrow, and then we can talk about the questions on Thursday, in case you're kind of wrapping those up. And those things are due on Friday, as we mentioned. And I know we went through this last time as well, but the quiz should, if I programmed it properly, should go live 12:01 on Wednesday, which I suppose is technically really late tonight or early tomorrow morning, and it'll be available for several days, but it's really due by midnight on Friday. Oh goodness, I sprayed myself with my drink. That's not cool. All right, let's go back to the notes. That'll be much better than me with a very large piece of ice that kind of clumped. All right. Document analysis. There we go, notes. Sorry. All right. How come it doesn't say where you left off yesterday? Okay. So chapter 2, we talked about all this stuff. I think we probably didn't talk as specifically about John Winthrop yesterday. John Winthrop is the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's the dude in the question. He's not the original one, but he's there for it's over 20 years. He is certainly the one who adjudicates when they kick out Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. He's seen sometimes as a little harsh. I would guess that's probably how you would view him for kicking folks out. He thought he was protecting the unity and therefore the very existence of the colony. So he thought he was doing a life-saving thing. I am not saying it justifies it or makes it right. I'm just trying to express his perspective. The Puritan Dilemma book that I ended up reading many years ago for some class was a biography about John Winthrop. I said that like it was a question. It was a biography about John Winthrop. It's an older book. And because I had really old professors, I was thinking about that the other day. Almost everything I read was probably kind of old when I read it until a little later in graduate school, and I had a few younger folks as professors. But the Puritan Dilemma talked about Winthrop's trip over to the American colonies, and he came first and then had his family come later, and several of his family members died in a shipwreck. And so there's a lot of inclusion of his journals where he talks about how much he missed them when they died and how much grief that caused him. So he vowed when he remarried, because everybody did, and had more children because everybody did, that he would not love them quite as much. And the reason for that, I always thought, well, I'd love to be John Winthrop's second wife, so he wouldn't love me quite as much. But the thought was that the grief was so intense for him that he felt like it almost caused him to stop loving God. So he thought that he had loved his family more than he had loved God. So he needed to love them more moderately so that their loss wouldn't cause him as much grief. And so most of that book is really a discussion of how to be moderate as a Puritan, a lot of Winthrop's musings about how to be moderate. So if you were to read that in a, don't, I mean, you don't have time and it wouldn't be exciting to you or anything like that. If you were to read that in addition to, the little bit of information you're going to get from this class, it might give you a slightly more balanced view of him. Not that you need that to have, your life be meaningful or anything, but I think it's just really easy when you have, if the only history class you ever have is really whatever you had in public school and then your history survey in college. And most of you, I don't know what's wrong with you, but most of you are not going to major in history or get a graduate degree in it and then teach history later. What the heck? There's no greater job in the world. So you don't love history the way that I love history, although some of you have already expressed lots of detail. So I know that there's certain parts of history that you are really interested in. That always makes me happy. But your goal isn't to get a very full view of who these folks are, but I think you can leave a history class with really a caricature or really surface understanding of who people are because it's a survey class. So yeah, Winthrop looks like a really big jerk, and I'm sure that he was in many ways, but he's also a fairly complex and intense person as well. Like later on, not much later on, when we get to Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is, we'll mention in passing as a really famous sermon where this Jonathan Edwards fellow gives a sermon and he says, "You're disgusting to God and he can hardly stand to look at you. And you should just feel glad that he's never dropped you in a flaming pit of fire because that's what you deserve." If that's the only thing you ever read about Jonathan Edwards, you go like, dang, that guy's a jerk. But if you read other stuff, I read some diaries. I had a professor that really liked this period. We read a lot of stuff, and it was pretty useful, to be honest. If you read some of the diaries of Jonathan Edwards, you find out like he's this weird, happy, bubbly sort of dude, which is not what you get in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So, to get a fuller perspective of these folks, if you ever have a chance, read more stuff. It's like Thomas Jefferson. You watch the news. There are places that are renaming things that were named after Thomas Jefferson because he was a slave owner, and he was a slave owner. There is no doubt that he was a slave owner. But I would always tell my high school students, and I guess you're getting to hear it as well, that you can be as angry as you want with Thomas Jefferson, for being a slave owner. That's fair. But there's no justification of it. I'm not trying to justify it at all. I'm just saying not uncommon during his time period, and also understood, is going to lead some discussions about why slavery needed to be ended. I know he didn't end it in his estimation, and he writes some really racist stuff. I mean, there's no way around that. But I would always tell especially the younger kids, that Frederick Douglass said there would be no freedom for slaves without Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence and the idea that all men are entitled to certain unalienable rights and that those rights are derived by God. And those are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that sort of thing. Oh, I think I just went to the Constitution. But the writings of Thomas Jefferson, the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson leads to political philosophy that leads to laws that lead to freedom for slaves. And again, I'm not suggesting that negates being a slave owner. It doesn't. But there are different perspectives. And Frederick Douglass's perspective shouldn't matter to you. You can I don't even know who he is. We'll talk about him later. All right. Enough talk about this, right? Okay. We talked about the Salem witch trials last time. You don't want to talk about that. You're good on this. All right. So chapter 3. Oh, yeah, this is where I have really short notes. So Whew, what a day. So Adam Smith and mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that you have a colony not for the benefit of the people within the colony, but for the benefit of the home country. So you want to make money. That's why you have a colony. Yeah, that's it. I know the Spanish said God, gold, and glory, and they put God first, but you know that gold and glory really probably mattered, except for De las Casas and no, some other priests too, but probably the gold and glory mattered more. And countries, even as altruistic as beautiful countries like Spain and France and the Netherlands and Portugal and England were, they're they're not starting a colony to benefit the people that they're taking over. They want the land, they want the stuff. You knew that, and yeah, okay. When it was, like in the modern era, when countries say that they're invading or assisting other countries to help them, they might be, but there's got to be some sort of self-interest in there as well. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't. Yeah. All right. So mercantilism, the idea that the mother country should control colonial trade for the benefit of the mother country, not the colonies. It's not to build someone else's economy up. Yeah. Just like do you watch the news? I know you're busy. Our vice president was in Guatemala City yesterday. I think she's in Mexico City today, and she'll be home by the end of the day, I trust. But unless there's a little issue with Air Force Two again, but she went to Guatemala City to, we're giving some foreign aid and to give some speeches. And her speech was essentially, don't come to the United States. It was stay home. Now we're giving foreign aid to Guatemala because we want to benefit Guatemala, maybe, or because the emphasis of the speech, don't come. So yeah, even when it looks like we're doing an altruistic thing, we're giving people money, there's probably another reason that we're doing it. Now, it could turn out well for Guatemala. Yeah, it could be helpful, but our goal is to make sure fewer people try to cross the border right now. There it is. All right. All right. So back to mercantilism and self-interest of the home country, which always happens. But it's going to lead to trade restrictions, enumerated items. There's going to be several laws that are passed in this chapter, in the era of this chapter, that enumerate certain items that can only be sold or traded with British traders or people from Great Britain. And so enumerated just means listed. It sounds really cool, but it's just a list of stuff. And these are things you can only buy from us or only sell to us. Taxes and Navigation Act. So this is the home country completely controlling the trade of the colony. And this is something you would expect in a colony. It doesn't seem unreasonable to home countries. And typically when you colonize, more of the French and Spanish and Dutch models, really it's just about trade. You're not trying to take over all the land, you're trying to control the trade of the land and the imports and exports. So this becomes different when you have a set of colonies where you send your own people over to set up houses and homesteads, and then you don't want to give them rights. Well, they expected rights because they came from your society. They go like, I get it if you don't want to give Native Americans rights because they're not nearly as cool as British people, but we're British people. You can't take our rights away. And then it leads to more eloquent discussions of unalienable rights and things like that. So when you're not getting your rights, then you figure, well, other people should get rights too. Okay. In this era, you see, we're talking 1600s, you see the English takeover of New Amsterdam to control British colonial trade. New Amsterdam, New Netherlands, the city, New York, and then the colony becomes, New York as well. And it was Peter Stuyvesant, who was the fellow who lived there, one of the leading citizens, who was Dutch. And he said, and he didn't say, but he said, we are not protecting our city, we're not protecting our colony. So it means it's going to be really easy for us to be taken over. We should probably have a citizen militia to protect ourselves. And they said, no, no, we really don't care. We came here to trade. We don't want to be part of a citizen militia. We don't see any purpose in that. And they were taken over by the British. Now, the British did make a deal with them. And the deals that they made were that several of the Dutch laws, system of laws, would continue. So there would be different rights of property ownership. Women would have a few more rights. There would be a less of a discussion of, a colonial religion, that sort of thing. So they really got to keep many of the Dutch laws. And that was sort of the deal. They said, you know what, we don't care who's in charge of our colony as long as we get to do business and make money. That's why we came here. So, and the Dutch had a very large share of trade because that's what the Dutch did internationally. So the English really wanted to control this colony so they could start making more money from this colony, which was starting to be a little expensive for them because they had some political officials and they had some military in the Americas. And it was expensive because the trip across the seas and supplying, sending supplies, that sort of thing, those were expensive. So governing and controlling and protecting the colonies cost money. So they needed to start making some income to cover their costs. And this section, or this part of the chapter, will talk quite a bit about the Carolinas. And my goodness, I remember I had a college professor who really liked Carolinas for some reason, which was really weird to me, but he talked about them a lot. And who was it? Anthony, I can't remember. There's one of the early leaders of the Carolinas. He talked about him all the time. Apparently made a huge impression on me because I remember it right now. But the Carolinas were primarily a slave colony. The initial thought was that there would be headright systems. You could import people from England to control this colony, and it would be set up. It would be set up with a constitution that people would follow. They couldn't get people to come over, so they ended up getting people to come over from the Caribbean. And it was usually the second, third, and fourth sons of slave owners in the West Indies. And those folks came over because they weren't going to have an opportunity to own land in those island states where they primarily grew sugar. The natives who lived in the Carolinas weren't terribly excited that people were arriving, and they were pushed out. They were defeated in wars. The book talks about this Yamasee uprising, and most of those natives will end up going to Florida. And one of the things you'll notice as we go through is that it's pretty common for native tribes to retreat to Florida. And that's going to be the place where you will see native tribes have more success, get to maintain some of their land than any other place on the eastern side of the country. So let's see. What else I want to say about this colony? I know you're thinking, if we knew that, you wouldn't have to say it. So it was about the Constitution that I wanted to say something, but I can't remember what it was. I'll think of it in a minute. But the Carolinas, staple crop. Let's talk about that, staple crop. So Carolinas, they grow a lot of stuff there. Indigo, rice, and cattle. Rice was probably the biggest. Seminoles are going to end up. I don't think the Seminoles are in the Carolinas. Let me look, see if it says anything in the text. I think they pretty much start in Florida and stay in Florida, but the Seminoles are really super unique. They may have started in the Carolinas, but they're the ones who are going to actually win wars against the British. and eventually against the US, and they get to keep their territory. And they're a really wealthy tribe. Yeah, no, they still, things go really well for them. They're just sort of tough. And then when runaway slaves need a place to go, that's where they go. They go join the Seminole tribe. So if you look at tribal role pictures, that sort of thing, you'll notice that lots of Seminoles appear to be African American, and they're African and probably truly American because they're part Seminole as well. Um, okay, crops, sorry. Rice is probably the biggest money-making crop that will happen in that era. And there's some nice swampy regions there. If you're wondering what indigo is, it's a plant that you use to dye clothing. And I think it produces kind of a deep blue purple sort of color, which was associated with wealth during that time period. And raising cattle is good. People like beef. So, oh, sorry, there's that giant piece of ice again. All right. Penn and the Quakers. The Quakers, William Penn his family was from England, and his family loaned money to the royal family. And so as a payback, because they really didn't have money to pay them back, they gave them a colony in the Americas. They said, you know what, I owe you a debt. Here's what I'll do. I'll give you someone else's land to repay that debt. So that's what they did. So William Penn, who was the Quaker son of the Penn family, and kind of an embarrassment because people didn't think that Quakerism was noble, that sort of thing. People thought it was a weird cult. So the family said, you know what, let's just get this dude out of here. So they sent their son to the Americas, and he established a Quaker colony. So Quakers are, they would have called themselves a Society of Friends. They probably would not have been impressed with the name Quaker. And people, it was sort of a nickname to make fun of them a little bit because they shook or quaked, I guess, while they prayed. Their thought was that everyone could live together in harmony, that God lived within everyone, so God could instruct you without benefit of written text. Not that they don't oppose the Bible. I'm not suggesting that at all. It's just they're not as intense about it, say, as Puritans are. And they're also not as insistent that you have to be able to read to get the message from God, because God within you has placed an inner light, which you might think of as a soul or a conscience, something like that, that combo, and that God can instruct you through your inner light. And so everyone is equal in a Quaker colony, whether they're male or female, old or young, despite their race or ethnicity. And of course, they don't have great concepts of race or ethnicity back then, but color, ethnic heritage, that sort of thing. So the Quakers under Penn are going to try to establish a colony where everyone is treated equally. And the thought was that since the land was given to them, but there were natives who were there, they could pay them for the land, they could have rights within the land, whatever it is that the natives wanted to do. They wanted to peacefully coexist with the natives. But the Quaker colony also let everyone in, whether they were Quakers or not. So not everybody who came in had that philosophy. So eventually Pennsylvania is going to be ruled by, or I don't know that ruled is the right word, governed is probably a better word, governed by people who don't have this Quaker philosophy. But initially, everybody's equal, there's not any slavery, and the colony is pretty diverse. It's going to have some pretty large cities, Philadelphia being the most obvious one, that will conduct a lot of international trade, and there'll be lots of craftsmen there. Most of the colonial furniture is made in that colony, so it becomes a pretty prosperous colony that has business, that has farming in the western part. And a lot of the people who initially moved to Pennsylvania are British, but a lot of the later immigrants, and I'm talking 1700s, but before the Revolution, the American Revolution. You're wondering, which one is she talking about? The U.S. Revolution. But before the Revolution, a lot of German people come over as well. And so if you read a lot of the writings of Ben Franklin, he occasionally dogs the Germans and thinks that they're not very cultured, that sort of thing. And then lots of Scots-Irish people who are fleeing persecution in England will come over, and those folks will move to Western Pennsylvania because their goal is really to stay as far away from traditional British people as possible because their experience has been bad. So this is going to be a really diverse colony, sort of the same way that New York was, because it's a little more international. It's focused on business, but not the Quaker colony wasn't started as an international business colony, but you will see by the time we get to the Revolution, there are people from several different backgrounds who move here. And the Quaker philosophy is more of that free thinking philosophy that leads to a little more religious freedom. And Quakers really have a more modern view of religious freedom. They want their own religious freedom, but they also want you to have religious freedom as well. So they're probably a little more what you would think of as modern in that way of thinking. They're also pacifist, which is going to cause them a huge problem during the Revolution. So we'll revisit that. Oh, sorry for the yawn. We'll revisit that when we get to the period of the Revolution. So they're not going to take sides in the Revolution, so they're going to be seen as traitors, and they're going to get harassed quite a bit. What else do we want to say about Quakers? Oh, the people who moved to the Quaker colony were supposed to pay William Penn a little bit of rent, and so that he could pay whatever taxes he was supposed to pay to England for being the lead in the colony, the head of the colony. He had a lot of trouble enforcing these rent payments, so they didn't always get paid. So he eventually ends up in debtor's prison. He ends up going back to England, having to go to jail for a while. So the colony is really successful and prosperous. Penn, not so much. Yeah. And let's see, the royal family owed the money, repaid them with the land. Okay, growing presence. Yeah. It's very diverse, prosperous colony, again, except for William Penn. So Quaker beliefs, God resided within everyone through the inner light. They didn't always have formal ministers. They did have a formal church, so they would get together Sundays to share whatever messages God gave to them. But, the message could be, one day from a native, one day it could be from a former slave. There are going to be a lot of freed slaves that will move to this region. One day it could be from a wealthy landowner, one day it could be from a kid, and they would accept that all as equal. But again, not everybody in Pennsylvania was a Quaker. So there you go. All right. Sorry for the other big yawn. Seem to be full of the big yawns today. All right. You peek back at and when the book talks about the colony as the holy experiment, it certainly was referred to that at the time period. All right, and then there's a big section in the book about slavery and indentured servitude, and how you see really a shift away from indentured servitude and toward slavery, and then a discussion of the Glorious Revolution. Let me scroll down. We got that in there. And then more of a discussion of the Salem witch trials again. And they put it in here really to put it a little bit more in context. Also, at the end of the chapter, I know you love your book, at the end of the chapter, around 115 or so, there's a pretty good map. It's not quite the end of the chapter, but there's a pretty good map that shows the different groups where people emigrated from. So kind of interesting there as well. All right, and I apparently was completely unconcerned about the role of women. What was I thinking? Because I didn't put a separate section in there, but we can talk about that in a minute. All right, so slavery, replaces indentured servitude during this era. And this era, once we get into the mid to late 1600s, early 1700s, is when you start to see this change. Bacon's Rebellion is probably, if looking for a specific event where we say this is the point where you start to see more intentional shift, that is probably it. But there certainly was slavery in the Americas, as you know, long before this. Um, and indentured servitude, certainly in the northern colonies, was much more common. As you get to the Chesapeake region and the southern colonies, you'll see a mix of indentured servitude, more indentured servitude early, and then the shift to slavery. You don't see as much slavery in the north, but you do see slavery in the north. So they will, a lot of the colonies will get rid of slavery, not a bunch, but several of the colonies, not half, but probably about a fourth of the colonies have already worked on emancipation before the American Revolution. And there's a huge debate about slavery in the American Revolution and in the writing of the Constitution, but also in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Hopefully you'll see reflected a little bit in my sample document analysis, which I know you're very excited about reading. Okay, so slavery replaces indentured servitude for a variety of reasons. One, laws in the British colonies made slavery perpetual. Now, I always think when I think about slavery, I always think about, I don't know, you guys are not as old as me, but I don't know if you ever read Facebook. Oh my gosh. When people put the dumbest things on Facebook, especially about history and politics, that's where you're supposed to put like pictures of your kids and stuff in the backyard. You're really not supposed to find history stuff on there because it's never right. It's never right. So I have more conservative friends and more liberal friends, and my more conservative friends, for whatever reason, will post really ridiculous, stupid, ignorant stuff about slavery in this time period, and it just makes my head hurt. So we should acknowledge that slavery, not unique to the United States, not unique to the American colonies. The part that is unique in this era is that slavery was typically not perpetual. I don't know, to me it's not funny. But at any rate, you know what the worst, I know we're not supposed to be talking about this right now, but the worst thing I've seen on Facebook, and every time I see it, if it's somebody I know, I will send them a message and go like, that is so wrong for 8 million historical reasons, is the enslaved Irish and how poorly the Irish were treated and how they were treated worse than slaves. It's like, that's painfully dumb. But anyway, all right. I apologize if I just called something that you thought painfully dumb. I'm sorry. That was not my goal. Yeah. Oh my goodness. And when I first started teaching, I'm not from Texas. I'm from Missouri. Yeah, we're so, it's so much better history on race and laws and slavery and things like that in Missouri. Oh my gosh. But when I first started teaching high school in a certain school in the school district I taught, and I taught at one school and then transferred to another, every time I would teach about the Civil War in my advanced class, because we really just review it in the on-level class, the kids would get upset with me because I would say that the main cause of the Civil War was slavery. And they would act like I had said the craziest thing in the world. And they would say, no, it was states' rights. And I went, I'll play along with you. States' rights, that's cool. It's like one of you already commented, what did the states want to control? And they go, well, because they don't want to say slavery because, they just told you one about slavery. They're like tariff policy. And I go, okay, I'll still play along. How many of you think we had a civil war because of tariff policy? Can you even name a tariff? It's like, okay. All right. Slavery. Okay. So one of the things that is different about slavery in this era is that slavery becomes perpetual. When you'd had slavery, it's as ancient as recorded history. it typically is because your people were captured or you're a prisoner of war. It's for debt, something along those lines. And typically your whole family's not enslaved for eternity. Um, you're enslaved until the debt is paid off. If you look at, I know we're going back to religious tradition, Jewish tradition, they had something called the Year of Jubilee, which if you read a lot of literature around the Civil War, there's a lot of discussion of the Year of Jubilee, and that's what the Civil War represented um, in some ways to people of that era. You're going like, it doesn't represent that to me. I get that. But the Year of Jubilee was, in Jewish tradition, the number 7 is holy. So after the 7th combination of 7 years, so after 49 years, in that 50th year, all debts are forgiven, all slaves are freed, that sort of stuff. So it's like you start over. And most customs, or I don't know, the custom's the right word, most societies that had slavery did not enslave people perpetually. This is the era where that starts. The English are going to do that in the Americas, and you're going to see other European groups do that in the Americas as well. And you see larger numbers of slaves in the Caribbean and South America at the beginning of this period because there are more cash crops being produced. They're primarily sugar. But as time goes along and as the United States becomes more prosperous, you'll start to see large numbers of slaves in the American South, primarily for cotton production, as you are well aware of. But in this era is where you start to see slavery um, replacing indentured servitude. The first reason is slavery becomes perpetual in the British colonies. So when you enslave someone, when they produce children, those children are also your slaves. So you own them, you own their family, kids, grandkids in perpetuity. Yeah. So slaves, children of slaves assume slave status. It's also why you see it very common for slave owners to rape female slaves to produce more slaves, or for slave owners to force male and female slaves to reproduce. So colonial authorities will begin to trace slave lineage through the mother. So that way the father, if the father is the slave owner, there's no claim of freedom, that sort of thing. And if for some reason the father who was a slave gains his freedom, he can't say, well, I'm free, therefore my child should be free. So tracing slave lineage through the mother and not recording the name of the father is going to ensure that the children of slaves don't have any legal status, essentially. And it does lead to more sexual abuse and rape of female slaves. And then Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s is going to have a pretty dramatic effect as well. And there's tons of stuff written about Bacon's Rebellion, and your book has a pretty good discussion of it as well. But Nathaniel Bacon is among a group of indentured servants who live in Virginia. And I know that you remember, however, just in case, indentured servants typically served 3 to 7 years, paying off their passage over to the Americas. They probably, were in debtor's prison and couldn't afford to pay off their debt. So somebody, a landowner in the Americas or someone who was financing a landowner in the Americas, agreed to pay their passage over. They agreed to serve for a certain number of years in exchange for that. And then when the period of servitude was over, they would receive either a cash payment so they could go buy some land or start a business or whatever, or they would get a piece of the landowner's estate, which was more common. But because there's not really law enforcement in the American colonies, a lot of times the indentured servants were not given the payment, or they were given a really terrible swampy piece of land where you couldn't grow anything. So they were essentially cheated. And they felt like, as British subjects, that they had certain rights, and those rights were not being afforded to them. and there really wasn't anybody in the American colonies willing to protect their rights, because when you had elected officials in your House of Burgesses, or colonial, excuse me, assembly, you elected rich guys. Thankfully, it's so much different now. You go like, it's not different now at all. Um, it is slightly different. We do occasionally elect people that aren't rich. But the only people who were in governing positions in that era were wealthy people or people who maybe had a military legacy. So they were not looking to be revolutionary to upset the status quo in any way at all. So if you were going to appeal to your colonial governor or House of Burgesses or assembly, colonial assembly, they weren't going to give you what you wanted. They just weren't. So um, let me try again. Nathaniel Bacon is frustrated because he doesn't think the rights of former indentured servants are being protected. And they're being given really, if they get land, they get really cheap land on the border where they're not protected from Native Americans. Now, the Virginia governor did not want to lead assaults on Native Americans because they had a period of relative peace and nobody wanted fights with Native Americans because it really affects the bottom line of your colony. It's really hard to do business when you're fighting. It just is. So, and that's one of the things that you'll notice if you study history extensively, is it's really unusual for wealthy people to lead revolutions because, things are going pretty well for them. The US Revolution is probably slightly different because it is led by upper class people, and then they kind of have to persuade folks in the middle or lower classes to join in. But business, um, the guys who had gotten this cheap land on the borders and they're not feeling protected, they're in more dangerous places, they decide that they're going to band together, led by Nathaniel Bacon. And he is going to say, we're going to form our own militia so that we can protect ourselves from native attacks. And we want voting rights for smaller landholders. And we also want a better opportunity to gain fur trading licenses. Now, Nathaniel Bacon wanted to be a wealthy guy. I suppose everybody does, right? I don't know. So he wanted a fur trading license because he knew that in Virginia he wasn't going to get any good farmland because that was already taken. So fur trading licenses could ensure that you become a wealthy person, but you had to apply to them, and the governor and the House of Burgesses granted those. They tended to only grant a few because if you granted too many, it's not a very lucrative job. So the official fur traders had to have a license, and then they traded through British agents, and you could trade the furs overseas unless you were like doing some smuggling, which certainly did happen during this era. But you're going to be much wealthier if you go through official channels. So they only approved a few per year, and they didn't approve Nathaniel Bacon's. They tended to approve, the second or third sons of people with landed estates so that they could become wealthy even though they didn't have land. So these, I don't know if you would think of them as middle class, potentially middle class, the smaller landowner guys really felt like their government wasn't protecting them, mostly because their government wasn't protecting them. But that was not the goal of that government. That government's goal was to protect the rights of wealthy people, and they were doing that because wealthy people were the only ones that got to vote. And that's another truism in representative government. However you're represented, if you're not represented, your officials are not going to protect you. That's just the way it goes. So if you don't vote, and I suppose that's probably even a better way to say it, if you don't vote, then your elected officials really don't care what you think or what you want. If you don't, do you believe that's true? If you don't believe that's true, ask why people who have lots of money have better tax laws. Ask why people who are married have more deductions in the tax. Ask why homeowners get deductions and renters don't. Because older people vote, younger people don't. And yeah, there you go. All right, so the governor is like, Bacon. You just need to calm down. Bacon leads a revolution. He gets a group of people who actually sign, about 23 people who actually sign on to the revolution. So they pledge, they say what they're doing, why they're going to do it. They want better safety, better protection, militia, fur trading license, voting rights for smaller landowners. So they burned down Jamestown in protest. It's always a good call. And they ask for Berkeley to resign, this sort of thing. What eventually happens is Berkeley does raise a militia that chases down Bacon. Now, Nathaniel Bacon ends up getting dysentery after burning down Jamestown, probably some of those little swampy mosquitoes. And then the rebellion falls apart. 23 of the people who sign on to the rebellion get captured and then hanged. This is also instructive for later on, if you think Declaration of Independence, because if there's a rebellion and you make a formal declaration of rebellion, so that's what Nathaniel Bacon did here, and you sign on to that formal declaration of rebellion, guess what happens if your rebellion doesn't work and you signed on to that formal declaration? You will be the first people executed. That's the way that's going to work. So when you think later about the people that signed the Declaration of Independence, kind of think back to Bacon's rebellion and notice what happens to the people who signed on, literally signed on to Bacon's rebellion. They are the first people executed. Many of the rebels who signed on to this rebellion were former indentured servants who felt like they did not get what they were due at the end of their period of indenture. England is not impressed by Berkeley's leadership. They send him home. They send a harsher colonial governor. And what they decide in the House of Burgesses, and formally and informally, is it is probably time to switch away from people who are going to demand their rights once their period of indenture is over and start to use a labor source that understands they have no rights and no protection. What else do we want to say about indentured servants? I feel like there's something else. If you're wondering why people used indentured servants, they were cheaper. Paying off somebody's debt or their passage over was going to be less expensive than purchasing slaves. And if you read, it's not cheery, and I don't know, it's important to read about this stuff, but if you read about how slaves were valued during that time period, they typically were brought over from Africa to some Caribbean island where they were essentially sorted. They called it seasoning. So they sorted the different groups of slaves for where they were going to send them. And the slaves that were sent to North America were more valuable because the idea was that they would live longer lives, that they were seen as more of an investment. And the slaves who were sent to the Caribbean, to the sugar plantations, were usually, their average lifespan was about 7 years, because the goal was to work them to death, and they were more likely to be killed in rebellion, that sort of thing. And there's also less chance that they're going to escape because they're on a smaller island. So it's easier to capture them. And you're not going to see a lot of rebellion, slave rebellion in the Americas in very formal ways. You don't see it very much in the Caribbean either until later, or South America until later. But slaves were expensive, and they were seen as a commodity. Indentured servants, they were seen as lesser versions of humans, but certainly still had rights, and they weren't seen as commodity, even though their labor was a commodity. There was an understanding that when the period of indenture was over, that probably you had to pay them something. Now, some people, I don't know that I would want to be one of those people, because the argument is difficult. would argue that that's part of the reason indentured servants were treated very poorly, maybe more poorly than slaves, because there was no the slave the person who purchased the indentured servant's service did not benefit by the indentured servant having a longer life. They actually benefited if the indentured servant died right at the end of his period of indenture, because then they had no legal obligation to pay off that indenture. That sometimes leads some very, I would say, unwise students of history to say that being an indentured servant was worse than being a slave. I would never say that, because nobody owns you. They own your service, but they don't own you. There is hope of freedom and a payment at the end. And you also, as an indentured servant, you chose to do that. As a slave, you never chose to do that. And whether they're enforced or not, there were certain rights that indentured servants had. There really weren't rights that slaves had. Yeah. And it's really kind of it's a difficult discussion anyway, because when you talk about a person as a commodity, I mean, you're already starting in just a horrible place for the discussion, aren't you? All right, so many rebels, former indentured servants, didn't believe they were fairly treated. Okay, so really after Bacon's Rebellion is when you start to see the shift in the Chesapeake and farther south toward the use of slaves and away from indentured servitude. All right, on that happy note, I think, were you guys okay with taking like a minute or two break? Did that bother you? Are you okay with it? Can I at least go get some water? You guys have any thoughts?
You can go get some water.
All right, thanks. All right, so if you need to go get some water, go to the restroom, that sort of stuff, take a minute or two, and then we'll come back in 2 or 3 minutes. Also think and see if you have any questions. Oh, let me pause the recording. Did anybody look at Okay, thanks for the break. Appreciate it. All right, back to the notes, and then we'll go back and talk about the question from chapter 3. Okay, so we finished talking about Bacon's Rebellion, which, did you notice, you probably did notice that occasionally there's something highlighted. Usually those are things that are in your review list. So for the review list for the multiple choice question. So that's part of why I highlight some of those things. Okay, and I don't know why I highlighted Bacon's Rebellion there and not up here. I don't know what I was thinking, but there you go. So King Philip's War during this time period, also going to be a rebellion of that era. King Philip, I think the other name that the English ascribed to him was Meta Comet. This Native American group decided that they had become too dependent upon the British for trade, and that it had changed their culture so much that they were no longer really an independent people. So King Philip was trying to get people to stop trading with the British, and certainly attacking some local villages. So, and this is happening right around the same time. And this is, let's see, King Philip's War, I want to say, is a little farther north. I think that it's in Massachusetts. It's terrible when you can't remember stuff. That's also a sign that I'm not going to ask you where King Philip's War was, isn't it? I think it just mentions it in passing, but I'm pretty sure, I'll double check before we talk again. But King Philip's War is put down, and it's not successful, but it is sort of a sign that the English are probably going to have a stronger military presence, and probably going to have to make some changes if they want the colonies to be prosperous and controlled. So, and then you had a Protestant uprising and rebellion. So you had a Protestant rebellion or uprising in Maryland. So you've got to push for smaller groups of people to want more rights. Now, I wouldn't say that this is a traditional um, civil rights movement or anything. This is just people who might be considered middle class, wishing that they could vote, essentially, or wanting to protect their property rights. So, I mean, it's a very kind of early American revolution. It's like, keep my stuff safe and let me vote. But we don't want to let everyone vote. We don't want to let everyone have stuff, because we really don't want everyone to have rights, just the important-ish people. So smaller landowners maybe. And you also have the Pueblo Revolt or Popes Rebellion contemporarily as well. And that's the pushback from the natives against the Spanish, who are controlling trade in an unfair way and enforcing, or trying to enforce maybe enforce is the right word as well, their religion onto natives. So you're seeing some pushback from people who feel like they're not being treated properly by their authorities. So you've got a lot of political and social unrest in this era. This is the era where James II replaces Charles, and the English are fearing a return to Catholicism because James II was in the Catholic wing of the royal family, and so there was a fear of persecution, English religious-based civil war, that sort of stuff, tyranny. Also an era of the creation of the Dominion of New England, where individual colonies didn't get to appoint their own, didn't get to elect their own governors. The colonial charters are revoked. And then what ends up happening is royal governors are appointed, and then there's Edmund Andros is appointed as the governor of the Dominion of New England. So all of those Northern Puritan style colonies that were used to congregational government in their church and in their town, they were not okay with the Dominion of New England. So that the Dominion of New England, the reign of James II, is going to be replaced during the Glorious Revolution. It's a bloodless change of power in England, where William and Mary combine a couple of different important royal families in the European tradition, and they ascend to the throne by agreement with the Parliament. And the agreement that they make is that they will share power, that they will allow the Parliament once again to help make decisions in a more constitutional way that had been done previously. So, and William and Mary are going to be seen as more moderate leaders. Now, it's bloodless in England. They end up shipping James II. I want to say he goes to Scotland, but they ship him out of town. Nobody dies. There's no fighting, that sort of thing. You see the creation of the English Bill of Rights and the English Toleration Act. So English Bill of Rights is going to ascribe rights to landowners more than an English Toleration Act is just going to put into law that it's okay to be whatever version of Christian. In the American colonies, it's not as bloodless, although there's not a huge fight. Some weird stuff that goes on in New York and Maryland, a couple of rebellions, and the Leisler Rebellion is in New York. This Jacob Leisler guy, who's probably not okay, takes over some fort in England, takes over some fort in New York in the name of William and Mary. And before they ascend to the throne, then they ascend to the throne, and he won't release or relinquish control of it. And so they end up executing him in a really gruesome sort of way. There was some textbook I used that described that in great detail, which isn't really necessary, but it was pretty bad. But I think he's the only real casualty. And this Edmund Andros, apparently he was about to be a casualty before they shipped him back to England. So people really resented him because people, especially in the New England states, they assumed their voice mattered. Puritans really believe their opinion matters. They always did. It's part of their tradition, which is why, voting is such a big deal, and education and all that sort of thing, because their individual rights really matter. Yours may not, but theirs do. But yours do if you live in their colony. American colonies leads to dissolution of the Dominion, freer worship within the Bible Commonwealth. So we're talking again in those northern New England states, and a more secular determination of voting rights and appointment of royal governors. So you keep the royal governors. Probably going to be more voting rights. There are more voting rights for smaller landowners. And in those colonies with more of a tradition where they combine some of the religious leadership with the church leadership, you will see that start to dissolve during this era. And that's part of the reason some people speculate, and I know we talked about the fungus in the grain as well. Again, that's such a complicated issue, the Salem witch trials, but this political upheaval and unrest is also part of the reason that it led to, potentially part of the reason that it led to the Salem witch trials, which most historians, and historians, they look at things differently, are going to look at this as a reaction to political and economic turmoil of the era. And there's a little more detail in this chapter about the Salem witch trials. About 200 people accused of witchcraft. Most were women, older women, potentially more financially independent. If they had outlived their husband, they probably controlled their husband's estate. 19 executed, spectral evidence. I think we talked about that yesterday. Visions and dreams that somebody was a witch. Those things were allowed as evidence. Can you imagine? It's crazy. That was a judgment, wasn't it? But I'm sticking with it. Was allowed until the mayor's wife accused of being a witch because somebody had a dream about that. And other educated Puritans, I'm not saying these folks weren't educated. They were, to a greater extent than most people in the colonies were. They were literate, that sort of thing, at least enough to read the Bible, because, you got to have God talking to you through the Bible. But the larger Puritan communities where they had universities and really valued education and science, goodness, if you look at when they start doing inoculations for smallpox during this era, they use cowpox vaccine and somehow get it in your bloodstream. I don't even want to think about how they did that. But the colonies that were most likely to accept these science of vaccination during that era, and it truly was a science. I'm not mocking it as science. It wasn't, some spiritual belief or anything. It was their true attempt at science for that era. But the people more likely to accept those ideas were in the larger, more cosmopolitan Puritan communities, because that's where you're going to have a higher literacy rate and a higher level of education. So most Puritans at this point, we're talking Salem witch trial point, really weren't averse to education or science or things like that. They really thought that science and religion kind of fit together in a certain way, which is kind of an American belief, depending on when and where and that sort of thing. So the Salem was really an aberration. It was really kind of an odd place. I know I've said that more than once, but mostly because it's true. But it's a bad thing. Again, no one would ever suggest that we discount it at all. And I know that we mentioned this too, or I mentioned this yesterday, that part of the reason there's so much written later, like in the 1950s, about the Salem witch trials, and you see the Arthur Miller plays and those sorts of things. And the modern literature, whenever you see I haven't read it, you're going to be upset with me, The Handmaid's Tale, all of those things where they're complaining about Puritans, they're not complaining about Puritans, they're complaining about modern political issues. In the 50s, it was McCarthyism. So that anti-communist repression of free speech. Yeah. Okay. All right. That's mostly it, isn't it? Is that mostly it? Oh yeah. And the book also talked about the changing role of women during this time period, and I I think I'd mentioned some of the other stuff that the book talked about. The different people migrating, especially a large German migration, the ascent of colonial artisanship in cities. So people making furniture, um, jewelry, candlesticks, material culture kind of stuff. It's also a sign that people in the Americas have more money because they're starting to buy stuff they don't need. They're also starting to buy stuff they don't need and charging it, which is going to create a financial issue, which is going to be kind of an interesting and weird thing. The book is also going to mention that the more aristocratic societies, the planter societies, kind of see the world in a different way. They have more stuff. They see themselves as superior, that sort of thing. Um, Also, if you are wealthy, a sign that you are wealthy is that you will send your kids to Europe for their education. And if you're kind of upper middle class-ish, maybe your kids like Thomas Jefferson went to William and Mary. But they are going to start to create a few colleges in the Americas for the kind of lower part of the colonial elite during that era. Your family probably, if you were wealthy, would design a coat of arms. But the sign of wealthy people during that time period was a contemporary flaunting of their wealth, like buying things you don't really need, sending your kids to college, which no one needed during that time period. You really just did that to show that you had money to waste. Yeah, because why did you need to go to college during that era? In our era, the assumption is if you wanted a certain type of job, I don't even want to say a good job, because we know there are good jobs without college. But if you want a certain type of job, maybe a promotion at your current job, maybe college is required. Back then, college was required. Maybe if you wanted to be a minister, that's about it. So, um, women. Um, this is really an era where women didn't have jobs outside the home. Well, honestly, there probably aren't a lot of jobs outside the home. Um, but women weren't going to have voting rights. They weren't going to have rights of inheritance, but they were going to have the opportunity to work a lot. And smaller farms, women are probably working alongside the men. And certainly poor women always worked. Middle class women always worked too. There just weren't as many middle class people during this time period. So um, one of the things that the book will point out, and that you'll notice as you read through history, is typically, I think the modern era might be a little different statistically, but not completely. Typically, colonies, cities, communities, societies are more stable if their families are more stable, because it leads to economic stability, and economic stability leads to the other sorts of stability where you're more likely to have a reasonable education or maybe a superior education for the time period. Whatever access to healthcare is reasonable during that time period, and financial stability. Financial stability leads to lots of the other types of stability. You're going to have a safer place to live, a better diet, more access to education, services that you need, that sort of thing. So the book points out too that the more stable the family is, likely the more affluent the family is. And one of the things that you'll notice if you compare colonial wealth, there's more wealth in the South among individuals. Like you're going to find the richest people in the colonies are probably going to be plantation owners. But as a percentage of the population, they are a very small percentage. They have a ridiculous amount of wealth. Now there are some wealthy, there are wealthy businessmen in the North as well, but plantation owners are going to have a disproportionate amount of wealth within their states. But within their states, you either have like rich guys or poor guys or slaves, and there's just not much in the middle, which is part of why Bacon and his group were frustrated. It was hard to be in the middle. The places where you saw people in the middle were in New England, because they usually came over with families. They assumed that every landowner should have certain rights, and almost everybody was a landowner. So you didn't see as many wealthy people. You saw those guys more maybe in cities because they owned maybe farmland and a business. And certainly New York City or Philadelphia, you would see some wealthy businessmen. But in the middle and northern colonies, you were more likely, cities in the middle colonies and pretty much all of the New England colonies, you were likely to see kind of a general dispersion of wealth. So there was essentially a middle class. And in those colonies, you see the development of things like public schools, public colleges. Well, yeah, I guess we could say public colleges, um, and really an expectation of more representative government. Because if everybody's a landowner and everybody's educated, everyone seems to have an expectation that they will have certain rights. And you're also more likely to see freed slaves or no slaves in those colonies as well. And a lot of times I know we don't always think of religious groups as being the most forward thinking and the most likely to push for rights, but you are more likely to see Puritan congregational Christians and Quakers opposing slavery during this era as well. All right, I feel like I'm done with chapter 3. I feel like it. All right, you guys have questions you would like to ask before we look at the question from chapter 3? Is there anything you want to ask? Okay, feel free to pipe, to say something. Where did the questions go? Sir, no, where are the questions?
No questions for me.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. All right, let me try to share the document. I'm really struggling this morning. All right. Every morning, that's why I have to apologize to morning classes. All right. So for the chapter 3 question, explain how and why. Oh, and you probably noticed that even though I typed page numbers in here on chapter 2 question, those are not going to show up in the saved version of it. So you'll have to either write those down or come back and look at the recording. I thought I was going to make it the whole class without coughing too terribly much. Sorry. So for chapter 3, I explain how and why tobacco planters in the Chesapeake region came to rely on African slaves rather than European indentured servants. And, the Bacon's Rebellion part of the chapter is probably going to be the part that you're going to want to look at. If you start on this one around page 98, that's where it's going to start talking about slavery in the law, the rise of slavery in the Chesapeake. And the Chesapeake is primarily Virginia and Maryland. And that's where you start to see that shift away from indentured servants. The southern states, those states pretty much, they use more slavery than indentured servitude and kind of start that way and end that way. They're also developed a little bit later. But if you look through page 98 to about page 107. 98 to 107. Let me type that in for you. This is probably where you're going to find the best information. Let me type it in before I forget. And I know that I've told you this before, but I really would prefer that you use the textbook rather than look this stuff up online, because the textbook's a little more verifiable source. I'm not saying that online stuff is wrong. I'm just saying that crud. I don't know what the heck, why the heck people think that, oh, what happened there? That, oh, that's weird. Sorry. I don't know why people think Wikipedia is a good source, but all of us can go in and edit a Wikipedia article from time to time. And I know that who I had a student one time who did that, and they made Abraham Lincoln the largest slave owner in American history, and that stayed on the Wikipedia page about Abraham Lincoln for about 3 weeks because he kept monitoring it. All right, so when you answer question number 3, you probably want to talk about the change in the laws, and you also want to talk about Bacon's Rebellion. I think those are the two big things that you want to talk about. So talk very specifically about those things. So name names and dates and places and that sort of stuff. And I don't know that I have a whole lot more that I should say about that. The book is going to go through the history of slavery, how typically slaves, had been for a brief period of time, all the stuff that we talked about today, and then slavery becomes more tied to race and becomes more of a perpetual slavery once it's tied to race and racism, that sort of thing. It's going to talk about the use of slaves in the West Indies and how some of that sugar plantation slavery tradition, which was incredibly profitable for those um, plantation owners, ends up being moved to the Americas. The changes in slavery from it being, a debt sort of thing to perpetual slavery. And it also talks about how the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Dutch viewed slavery as well. So there's a little bit of a discussion there. And then the rise of slavery in the Chesapeake that section's combined with the discussion of Bacon's Rebellion. So it could be a fairly complex discussion, but it's also, I think it's easy to find the answers to this. And they also have in the Voices of Freedom section, the 2 excerpts, the document excerpts. I should use one of those documents for your document question, shouldn't I? It's like, why did I not do that? I'll do that for the next section. There's a Maryland Act concerning the slaves, and then a letter from a female indentured servant, and it'll show you the different situations that the servants or the slaves are in, and how that becomes more advantageous for the person purchasing the labor or using the labor to move towards slavery, even though the initial purchase of the slave is going to be more expensive and more complicated. The lasting result is going to be much more advantageous for the slave owner. So they're going to see this as really purchasing a commodity rather than a service if you switch from indentured servitude to slavery, with fewer strings attached in a lot of ways and perpetual labor. Oh, and I know it's a rough way to think about that. It's certainly how they thought about it during that era, but once you dehumanize a group of people, then it becomes easy to mistreat them. And I think that's what you see in the European tradition with this change in African slavery. All right, I don't know if there's other stuff that we should say about that or that you want to talk about that. Just as a reminder, I'll finish the document example. I'll do that in just a little while and post that. So hopefully I can get that done before noon. We'll see how quick that I am. But I won't do anything else today, any other task before I do that. So I'll do that first. And see, tomorrow we'll go over chapter 4 and look at the question from chapter 4. And then on Thursday, we'll spend a part of the class talking about the questions, maybe reviewing anything that you have concerns about for the quiz. And then we'll probably get started a little bit on chapter 5. Just a little, maybe not too much, but a little. All right. Do you guys have any questions? Don't leave just yet because I want to double check the roll. But I'll keep recording until I see if you have questions. Anybody want to ask anything? You don't have to tell me no. You can, but you don't have to tell me no. I don't see any. I'm clicking on the thing to see if you have any raised hands. No, we just have the dog and somebody in their submarine uniform. Very nice. All right.